Before we get to the texts, I thought that I wanted to start with this short clinical example, this vignette, because it might help us with some of the topics. This is from one of my clients, and this happened this week. And this is a client who lives in the UK, and she is planning to travel to the USA to meet her brother, who lives in Florida with his family. And several things are happening in her life at the same time. One of those things is that she has just bought her first apartment. She has been renting her whole life, and for the first time she will own her place. And this is in a context in which she's looking for more stability and less chaos in her life. Like her previous visits to his brother also turned out to be quite chaotic. It's like a quite chaotic family. She is single, and she's been also wanting to be in a stable relationship for some time. So in the dream, she's sitting next to a person, to a guy. It's not a sexual attraction, it's just some kind of polite conversation. And she describes this man that appears in the dream as being very big. And she says also fat. But he's a friendly man and he feels safe. And she makes the point that usually she doesn't like, she's not attracted, let's say, sexually to big people. She prefers like lean, thin people, right? So this man, who is very friendly, offers her to explore Seattle with him. Now, the point is that she is in this flight going to visit his brother in the US. But in real life, the brother lives in Florida. But for some reason, this flight is not going to Florida. It's going to Seattle. When I ask, after she finishes telling me the dream, I ask for associations, and she says, well, Seattle for me would be like also a friendlier place because it's like Florida is too conservative, I'm more liberal, and I know that Seattle is a more liberal and open-minded place. And this friendly person who's sitting next to her offers her to explore Seattle with him. He says he will guide her and he will take her to natural places, like a natural reserve with waterfalls and a butterfly sanctuary. But then there is a strong turbulence in the flight and they get lost. She loses contact with the man, and then the plane lands, and then she realizes she's not in Seattle, but in Japan. And she starts in the airport searching for the man, asking strangers if they have seen him, but she realizes she doesn't know his name. So she can only ask for a big guy, and nobody has seen this big man, and so she cannot locate him. So this is the dream. I told you already some of the associations, but my intervention there, and this was risky for me because English is her native language, but not mine. So every time I'm doing like kind of Lacanian interpretation in which I'm playing with the signifier, sometimes I'm not sure that what is very clear displacement of a signifier to another, let's say from a word to another word, sounds to me like it should be, but I'm not 100% sure this will resonate with the client. But my intervention is to ask her, are you going to Seattle or are you going to settle? Why? Well, there was this contrast in the dream between the settled situation, the peaceful situation at the beginning, and then everything gets unsettled after the turbulence, and all these other things that are appearing in her discourse, right? About settling down, having her own place, living a more settled life, and the fear of being in a very chaotic context when she goes and visits her brother, etc. So I thought this was intersecting in many ways. There were many chains of association that ended up there. So this is what I thought, that the dream distorted, replaced to settle for Seattle. Also, I think there is kind of a conflict that she's trying to process because in a way, and I think this is why this big man appears, she's also asking herself in a way if she needs to like settle for less, like to accept that things will not be as she planned. So, rather than having this, what was like a sexy ideal in her mind, she has this, okay, not not very attractive, but nice guy, settled guy, sitting by her in the plane. And you remember that when we read, I think the first of the short articles by Freud that I suggested we can read was the one on constructions in analysis, right? And there Freud says the confirmation of an interpretation is not the yes or the no of the analysand, but is what else they produce after our interpretation. And when I ask her this, are you going to Seattle or are you going to settle? Her response is to remember that this week she had met a man in a shared office space where she works, and that he actually looked very settled in the sense that he has a stable life structure and also lives near where she lives. And also the way she describes him after my interpretation is, she says, I am not interested in him, which I thought was very funny, but also it's a very interesting use of negation, right? Because this is what also I suggested that we read for today. It's like this very short, incredible, for me, one of the most beautiful pieces written by Freud. Very short, very concise, and with some beautiful insights. And one of those insights that Freud brings is that one of the functions of negation, when you say, for example, I'm not interested in this in analysis, it might mean that you are actually interested, or at least you thought about it, right? That's why you need to negate it. But also, what negation does is separates the content from the affect. So you can say something that creates some kind of emotion, desire, disgust, seduction, whatever. But because you are saying that you are not into that, then it shouldn't affect you. So you are able to think about the content without being affected. The reason why I brought this case was because of this, of how the confirmation of the interpretation comes, about this use of negation, and also because of the play between signifiers. It doesn't mean that one has always to interpret in this way. There are many symbols and many, but you can see, for example, how different this is from a Jungian interpretation that is based on universal or shared archetypes, symbols, right? And here we're looking for something that is very unique, very specific to the client, and it's a result of some kind of displacement that occurred in the processing of this dream. And so we are reconstructing what's at stake here, right? So there was this situation in her office that probably recreated for her this conflict about whether she should aspire for more or she should just settle for what she has. And I wanted to do a little summary of the things we've been working on, because Lacan is not systematic at all. He's exploring different things, connecting different things. So I thought it was a good idea at this point to stop and look what we've been discussing in these first four sessions. So we are working on the first lectures from 1954. Lacan is proposing that we return to Freud, that we reread Freud. And what this implies is that we go there with a fresh attitude and forget a little bit about all the new theories of the ego psychology and of the object relations, and go back to what is so fresh and so alive in Freud's text, which is his experience as he is making his attempts and discovering the unconscious. And so there is a similarity between being in analysis, which is also an experience in which you are discovering the text of your own life, and reading Freud and what Freud was going through when he was discovering the unconscious. This goes hand in hand with Lacan's critique of ego psychology. Ego psychology was this school of psychoanalysis founded by Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, and also was very popular in the United States. And it was created after Freud postulated the structural theory with the ego, the superego, and the id. And it tries to create an alliance between the quote-unquote mature or healthy part of the analyst and also the healthy part of the ego of the client. So this alliance ego to ego is very important, and there will also be the part of the ego in the client that is resisting analysis. And so we need the analyst here in ego psychology needs to disarm these defenses. How do you defeat this defensive aspect of the client? By analyzing transference in the here and now of the session, right? And Lacan criticizes this because he says, well, okay, this is nice. It's a two-body psychology. It's true that there is a relationship between two people. And it's true that there is a here and now of the session and people feel things. But if we remain only on this level, this is just one part, one aspect of what's going on. This is the part that is the imaginary ego to ego level in which two people are identifying with each other, projecting into each other. And actually, if you are reacting with your own ego, you are actually playing for the resistance, not for the analysis. Because the work of analysis is done when the client, the analysant, a little bit forgets that you are there. This is why in classic psychoanalysis, it would be lying on a couch, looking to somewhere else, not to the analyst. So forgets about this, that the other person is there, and allows free association to reign, right? Free association, when we allow free association, we will get closer and closer to what Freud calls this pathogenic nucleus, right? And here we have full speech as revelation, says Lacan. But at some point, this will be very hard because we're getting closer to this traumatic nucleus. So full speech will stop, revelation will stop. And what happens at that moment? There is resistance. Resistance is everything that is interrupting or being an obstacle for analytic work. At that moment, when resistance arises, you speak from your own ego and you speak to the ego of the analyst, right? So if we look even at Anna Freud's description of the mechanisms of the ego, the dissociation, the projection, the ego is a defensive formation. This is a very radical formulation that Lacan makes. The ego is a defensive formation. So it's not the same, the ego, to say the subject. So simplifying a little bit, Lacan is interested in subjectivity, in the subject, not in this imaginary phenomenon called the ego. We will come back to this many, many times, the attempt at differentiating the ego from the subject, right? But the aim of psychoanalysis is that the subject can speak, can reveal something about himself, especially when he fails, right? When he forgets something, says the opposite of what he wanted to say, he or she, right? And working on all the formations of the unconscious, the dreams, etc., you are able, as a subject, to assume your own history through a symbolic articulation with the help of the analyst, who will help you with the construction. This is more or less a summary of what Lacan has been proposing in these first lectures. Lacan takes what Freud says in another short article we were commenting upon, which is Dynamics of Transference. And Freud says, this goes along the lines of what we were saying. If you read Freud carefully, you will see that he doesn't say that the ego is the ally of the analyst. Actually, the opposite. He would say, for example, that when you are associating and then you stop, then your analyst can ask you, doubtless you're having some thought that relates to me? And the answer will almost always be yes. Oh, yes, I noticed that new painting on the wall. Or I thought you would be upset about this. Or that you were bored with what I was saying. All these excuses that interrupt free association usually relate to the person of the analyst. And now I will read from Lacan. This is not exactly as it is in the seminar, but more or less I adapted it a little bit. Lacan says, just when he seems ready to come out with something more authentic, more to the point that he has ever managed to come up with up to then, so this would be revelation, full speech, then the subject in some cases breaks off and utters a statement which might be the following: I am aware all of a sudden of the fact of your presence. So again, we see Lacan reading Freud, but also radicalizing it. It's not just that you are using the analyst as an excuse. It's that you went from one logic to another. You went from the logic of full speech, free association, revelation, to communication, ego to ego. Communicating ego to ego, what do we do when we communicate? We're not talking about ourselves, right? We are trying to adapt to the other person. We realize there is another person. We need to be polite. There are rules, societal rules. We need to be appropriate. We need to like and be liked. So we stop free association and we become aware that there is another person there. Lacan makes also in these classes several references to one of Freud's most famous cases, which is the Wolfman. This was a case of what in psychoanalysis is called obsessive neurosis. Today we would say he was an OCD patient. I will just focus on one part of this case, which is a central part of the case. And this patient used to have, when he was a little child, recurrent dreams, nightmares with wolves. Right? In this, for example, he would be looking through the window of his room in the dream, and he would see a tree out there, and on the branches of the trees, there would be several wolves, and they would be looking at him with a fixed gaze. So I'm summarizing this. It is a long analysis, but Freud come to the conclusion that what this represents is the primal sin. So Freud believes that more or less when the patient was 1 year and a half, he saw his parents having sexual intercourse. And so the different elements of this dream refer to that. So, for example, the fixed gaze of the wolves corresponds to the child's position of looking and being looked at. Like he entered the room, watched his parents looked at him. The terror is related, according to Freud, to a castration anxiety. So Freud thinks that he observed the parents having, he uses the Latin term, coitus a tergo, which is the man entering from behind. So this also includes a passive position. The mother would be in a passive position, the father in the active position. So this confronts the child with sexual difference. The man has the phallus, the penis, the woman is castrated, and this creates castration anxiety in him. This is why also he is representing the sin with wolves, right? Because this is how animals have sex. Right. So now Freud says something. He uses a term in German that we'll get back to that. But the term that I will introduce now is connected to the fact that, according to Freud, something was not inscribed symbolically in the patient. The patient still didn't have like signifiers, symbols in order to process this sin. So this sin had to be in some way rejected, but then it comes back in the nightmare. If you look at the bottom of this slide, these are the words I want to introduce with you. When Freud talks about repression, this is a translation of a German word that is Verdrängung. I promise you I will not introduce too many German or French words, but there are a few that I think that are important. So Verdrängung is what we translate as repression, right? But in this case, for what the child did with this perception, this recognition, seeing their parents, seeing his parents having sex, he uses Verwerfung, which means rejection, repudiation, foreclosure. It's a legal term. When something is not even admitted in a judicial process, you completely reject it. It's not included in the symbolic processing. So the idea is, in repression, something is included, some content enters your representations, your associations, your thoughts, but it's unacceptable for the ego, for the consciousness, so you repress it. Oversimplifying, in Verdrängung, it entered, but then was repressed. But in Verwerfung, like the door is closed. This cannot even enter the system. Rejection. So this is how Lacan explains what Freud is saying. For repression to be possible, there must be a beyond of repression, something already primitively constituted, an initial nucleus of the repressed, which, for not being formulated, is literally as if it didn't exist. This is what falls under Verwerfung, right? What is Verworfen? And yet it is somewhere, since it is the center of attraction, calling up all subsequent repressions. So the child enters his parents' room. There's something that he cannot process, and this is rejected. It cannot be symbolized, but at the same time forms some kind of nucleus, some kind of primary repression, and all subsequent repressions are constituted on top of this initial nucleus. This is the meta-psychological theory that Freud formulates and Lacan is explaining. I just want to, for those of you who know a little bit about Lacan, you might know that then later in Seminar 3, when he's explaining psychosis, he gives a more central role to Verwerfung, to this rejection. He actually thinks this is the mechanism that explains psychosis. But at this point, in Seminar 1, he has not still formulated this, right? So what he's establishing is just a differentiation between some kind of primordial, original mechanism in which you simply exclude something that you cannot symbolize, but then this forms the basis for subsequent repressions. Verdrängung, repression, is a technical term in Freud. Verwerfung is not. Freud does not give this term like a role in his system, in his theory. But Lacan, when he rereads Freud, he stops there, looks at this word, and thinks, there's something here. There is a different mechanism, and we should pay attention to this little word that Freud uses a few times, Verwerfung. So let me read from this slide. In the Wolfman, Freud distinguishes the Verwerfung of the realization of genital experience from all the other moments. This is pretty much quoting from Lacan, almost the same. So what he's saying is Freud distinguishes the rejection of the realization of genital experience from all the subsequent moments in the repressive process, in the repression. Something that is excluded from the subject's history had to be forced out by Freud in order to see the back of it. So what he's saying, this connects with constructions in analysis. Freud didn't have any proof that this person, when he was 1 year and a half, witnessed his parents having sexual intercourse. This is a construction. This is a conjecture that Freud brings in order to make sense of the situation, right? So this is why he says that something that was excluded, rejected, had to be forced out by Freud. Only then the repeated experience of his infantile dream took on its meaning and made possible not the reliving, but the direct reconstruction of the subject's history. So we were talking about trauma also in our first meetings, and this is the idea. Here, psychoanalysis is not aiming at reliving trauma as it happened, but it's aimed at doing some kind of symbolic work that can provide a reconstruction of what happened, that allows the patient to process this and emerge in a different situation, right? Move forward. So here we have this contrast between the two modes of speech. Speech as expression, this is what we use in our everyday life. Speech mediates between the subject and the other. If I need to meet with you, I will tell you, okay, wait for you 4 o'clock in this corner. We are using speech to coordinate our social interactions. And when we do this, the other becomes present. This is being with others, right? And speech unites us. But at the same time, from the point of view of psychoanalysis, this is empty speech. You're not talking about yourself. And then the other type of speech, Lacan calls it revelation. And he says the whole of Freud's work unfolds in the dimension of revelation, not expression. The point of free association is to get at revelation, full speech. I continue with Lacan. He says, the arrested arrivals of speech, so full speech that doesn't come to session, insofar as something perhaps renders it fundamentally impossible. That's the pivotal point around which, in analysis, speech entirely seesaws over its initial aspect and is reduced to its function, of relationship to the other. If speech then functions as mediation, it is on account of its revelation not having been accomplished. The degradation of speech happens in its relation to the other. Ego to ego, we don't go anywhere. We are going somewhere when the patient is free associating. This is full speech, but as we approach the traumatic nucleus, it becomes impossible. And so what we do, we rely on our relationship to the other, to the analyst. We think something like, oh, my analyst will think that this is stupid. I will omit this. Then speech becomes empty speech, functions as mediation with the other. So it's a degradation of speech from the point of view of psychoanalysis. So here I have a long quote from Lacan. I really want to read it, even if it has nothing to do with all the other things he's talking about, right? It's a comment he makes in passing, and I think it's pure genius. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Jean Piaget. He's the most famous cognitive developmental psychologist. More or less same age as Lacan. Was born, I think, 5 years before Lacan, right? And Piaget has a theory of cognitive development in which, again, oversimplifying, the child goes from an egocentric view of the world to a decentered view. In Piaget, this doesn't have any affective or emotional component. He's not saying that the child is selfish, not egocentric in this way. He's egocentric in the sense that it's very hard for a 3 or a 4-year-old child to take the perspective of the other. So he has all these little experiments with conservation of liquids. If you take, for example, a glass that is broader, you pass the water to another glass that is thinner but higher, the child sees this increase in the height of the water and says, there's more water now, right? But that's because he's centered in his own point of view of the water increasing in height. Lacan is criticizing Piaget, and he says, the same way of thinking leads Monsieur Piaget to talk of the egocentric idea of the infant's world, as if adults had something to teach kids on this subject. And I would really like to know what, in the scales of eternity, has the greater weight when it comes to a better apprehension of the other. That held by Monsieur Piaget in his professorial position and at his age, or that of a child. The child, we see that he is prodigiously open to everything concerning the way of the world that the adult brings to him. Doesn't anyone ever reflect on what this prodigious porosity to everything in myth, legend, fairy tales, history, the ease with which he lets himself be invaded by these stories, signifies to his sense of the other? Does anyone think that it's compatible with the child playing little games with blocks, thanks to which Monsieur Piaget shows us that he arrives at a Copernican view of the world? So the Copernican view would be the decenter view. He's saying the child is more of a subject, right? We are egocentric. Piaget, at his age, with all his prestige derived from his professorial position. Yes, Piaget died, I think, in 1981. And so they were both, Lacan at this seminar is 55 and Piaget must have been 60, let's say. But the point is very beautiful, is we say that the child is egocentric. Have you ever told a story to a child? How much attention they pay to every story, every signifier that adults bring to them, like the hunger they have for learning, understanding. Tell me that story again every night. Do you call this egocentric? There is this opposition between empty speech and full speech. Full speech, insofar as it realizes the truth of the subject, empty speech in relation to what he has to do ich et nunc, here and now, with his analyst, in which the subject loses himself in the machinations of the system of language. So this is a complicated phrase, but pay attention to this last part. The subject loses himself in the machinations of the system of language, in the labyrinth of referential systems made available to him by the state of cultural affairs to which he is a more or less interested party. So, a lot of words, he's saying something very simple. We live in a culture, we live in a society, we have shared topics of conversation. Today we could talk about the war in Iran or the weather, gossip about our neighbors, right? This is what we do when we are using these referential systems. Reference means the signifier pointing to a reference, to something that's happening out there in reality. And this is what you do when there is resistance, and in the context of transference, you share something with your analyst, right? But this is all empty speech for psychoanalysis. It's fundamental outside psychoanalysis, right? But it's empty speech from the point of view of the analytic process. And in the middle, we have a whole range of types of speech that can be closer to full speech or empty speech in analysis. The resistance in question projects its effects on the system of the ego. This, I think, is clear, right? That the ego is intervening when there is resistance. And he also says, the system of the ego isn't even conceivable without the system of the other. The ego has a reference to the other. The ego is constituted in relation to the other. It is its correlative. The level on which the other is experienced locates exactly the level on which, quite literally, the ego exists for the subject. Lacan's first important contribution to psychoanalysis was his work on the mirror stage. He presented this in a conference in 1936, but then he continued working on this piece and published it in 1949. And so a few years before this seminar. The important thing is that he works starting from the fact that at a certain age, around 1 year and a half, a child starts recognizing him or herself in the mirror. And when he does this, there is a sense of pride, of mastery. I'm the owner of my own body. I can see myself in the mirror. I can make gestures and see how the mirror reacts. There's usually happiness. You can see the joy in children's faces when they are doing this. This is some kind of narcissistic pleasure that I am whole, I am one, I have mastery over myself. But for this imaginary consistency to be achieved, Lacan says, it relies on this image, right? This other image that is facing me. I'm not looking at myself directly. I am looking at myself through this image in the mirror. And this kind of identification is then the identification we also do in relation to others. And this is how the ego is constituted in relation to others, which means that the ego depends on what comes back from this image that is reflecting me, or the other with whom I am identifying, which also means then that the ego, from its very birth, from the very origin, the ego is alienated in the other. It doesn't depend only in itself. It depends on another ego. So you, when you're growing up, you needed someone to tell you, oh, this baby is so beautiful. Oh, bravo, you did this. Oh, now he can walk. Now he can say this. Right? You're receiving this confirmation all the time, which is very important. We all need this for our ego to form, but also shows how the ego is alienated into the other. And he's reminding us now of his work on the mirror stage to say that when the ego appears in analysis, it's also this kind of alienation. You are alienated, for example, in the image of your analyst, or you are paying too much attention to how your analyst is seeing you, developing full speech and free association. For resistance, in fact, is embodied in the system of the ego and the other. It comes into being at this or that moment of the analysis, but it emanates from somewhere else, namely from the subject's impotence to end up in the domain in which his truth is realized. So he's saying, resistance arises from something internal to the subject's full speech. Something becomes impossible there, but it gets embodied in the system of the ego and the other. It's just at the moment when the speech of the subject is at its fullest that I, the analyst, can intervene. So the moment for the interpretation is when the subject is able to sustain his or her full speech. The more intimate the discourse is for the subject, the more I focus on this discourse. But the inverse is equally true. What can the analyst do with empty speech? The empty his discourse is, the more I am led to catch hold of the other, led into doing what one does all the time in this famous analysis of the resistances, led into seeking out the beyond of his discourse, a beyond, you'll be careful to note, which is nowhere, the beyond that the subject has to realize, but which he hasn't, and that's the point, realized, and which is, in consequence, made up of my own projection. So the sentence is very confusing, but the meaning, I promise you, is simple. He's saying, full speech, intimate discourse, free association, the subject is speaking and the analyst can intervene. That is the moment to intervene, right? When the unconscious is speaking. I thought I might be, I don't know, but my intuition was that was the moment to ask, are you going to settle or are you going to Seattle? That's the moment when the subject is speaking. Now, what happens when we have empty discourse? And he's again criticizing ego psychology, right? The subject is not producing anything, so you think that's the time to intervene. And you interpret at that moment. But at that moment, the only thing you can do is interpret counter-transference, interpret from ego to ego, and say something, oh, you are afraid to talk about this because such and such reason, right? Or you're afraid to talk about this because you think I will be scared to know, right? And you're pointing to as if there were something beyond empty speech. And he's saying, there's nothing. The only thing that there is beyond empty speech is the projection of the analyst, is an imaginary phenomenon. So the moment to intervene is when you can do a symbolic intervention. Play with the signifier, produce something, produce a new meaning in full speech. But when speech is empty, you only need to stop